She was murdered. It's all here. She wrote a whole letter about it. The world thought Diana's death was a tragic accident, but her brother has revealed something that changes everything. A final letter where she wrote she feared she would be killed in a staged car crash. Months later, she was gone, her words playing out like a prophecy. Charles Spencer's voice, heavy with grief and anger, has reignited the question that refuses to fade. Was Diana truly a victim of chance? Or was she silenced just as she had warned? The night everything ended in Paris. It was the early hours of August 31st, 1997, when the world shifted forever. In a dark Paris tunnel, a black Mercedes carrying Princess Diana, Dodi Fayed, and their driver slammed into the 13th pillar at high speed. They had been chased relentlessly by paparazzi on motorcycles, flashes blinding the driver, the car swerving as it tried to outrun the chaos behind them. When the crash came, it was violent. The vehicle crushed like a tin can, metal twisted around what was left of its passengers. For a few moments, Diana was still alive, trapped in the wreckage, gasping as rescuers tried desperately to pull her free. Witnesses described the scene as unreal, the kind of nightmare you couldn't wake up from. Inside that tunnel, confusion reigned. Ambulances rushed in. Police pushed back photographers who had been taking pictures even as she lay bleeding, and paramedics tried everything to keep her alive. Reports later revealed how she fought for hours, her heart stopping, restarting, and finally giving out before dawn. By the time the hospital made its announcement, the words felt heavy enough to crush the spirit of millions. Diana, the woman the world had called the People's Princess, was gone. The news spread like fire. First whispers, then breaking alerts, then the kind of headlines that stopped you in your tracks. Across Britain, people froze where they stood, televisions and radios pouring out the same devastating message. She wasn't coming back. But behind those first announcements, another story was unfolding. A story that would haunt her brother Charles Spencer for the rest of his life. In South Africa, Spencer was asleep when the first call came. The voice on the other end told him Diana had been in a serious car accident. He sat upright in shock, his mind racing with the years of harassment she had endured. The press had chased her down every street, followed her into restaurants, crowded her outside her home. Had their obsession finally ended in tragedy? As the minutes ticked by, he held on to a fragile hope. Maybe she would survive. Maybe this time she'd come out stronger, just as she always had before. But then came the second call. The voice was different this time, calmer, colder, final. Diana hadn't made it. She was dead. Spencer later admitted that in that instant, he didn't just feel grief, he felt fury. In his mind, this wasn't just a random accident. It was the inevitable outcome of a woman hunted day and night, pushed to the edge by a system that had never truly protected her. His sister hadn't simply died in a crash. She had been driven into it. As the world mourned, laying flowers outside Kensington Palace, crying openly in the streets, Spencer carried something heavier than loss. He carried the suspicion that Diana had been silenced, not by fate, but by design. He would speak about it later, in interviews and in his speeches. But in that moment, alone in the dark after that phone call, he knew something deep inside him had changed. For him, and for millions watching across the globe, August 31st was not just the day Diana died. It was the night innocence ended, and the night whispers of murder began. The funeral that haunted William and Harry. September 6th, 1997, was a day the world will never forget. From the early hours of the morning, the streets of London filled with millions of mourners. People carried flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes, their faces heavy with grief. Across the globe, over 2 billion more sat in front of televisions, holding their breath as they waited to say goodbye to a woman who had become more than a princess. She had become a symbol of compassion and humanity. But among all the heartbreaking images from that day, none cut deeper than the sight of 2 boys walking behind their mother's coffin. William was just 15, Harry only 12. They marched side by side, their heads down, their faces pale, surrounded by the weight of silence and sorrow. Every step they took seemed impossible, yet the cameras captured everything. The sobbing of the crowd thundered around them, but the boys never broke. They didn't cry, they didn't falter, and they didn't look away. To the world, they appeared brave, dignified, and strong. But for those who knew them, it was clear. This was not bravery. This was pain, hidden behind forced composure, a burden far too heavy for children to bear. Charles Spencer, Diana's brother, had fought hard to prevent this moment. When he learned of the plan to have the boys walk in the funeral procession, his reaction had been immediate and firm. He called it cruel, unnatural, and unnecessary. Diana, he argued, would never have wanted her sons paraded through London in their darkest hour, forced to share their grief with billions of strangers. But his protests were met with cold resistance. He was told that it had already been decided. And when he pushed back harder, he was told something that silenced him. William and Harry wanted to do it. Believing this to be true, Spencer reluctantly stepped aside. Years later, the truth came out. Harry admitted in interviews that they never had a choice. They were simply told what to do. For Spencer, this realization was devastating. He had trusted the palace's word, thinking he was respecting his nephew's wishes, when in reality, he had been deceived. That knowledge would haunt him, a reminder that he had lost the chance to shield them from one of the most traumatic moments of their lives. The walk from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey was long, painful, and unforgettable. Charles Spencer walked beside Prince Charles, Prince Philip, and the boys, each step echoing with sorrow. The world looked on in silence, and while many praised the boys for their composure, Spencer saw something else entirely. He saw 2 children carrying the weight of duty when they should have been allowed to grieve in private. He saw an injustice he couldn't stop. Harry later described the experience as numbness, as though his emotions had been shut off completely. For him, the funeral was something happening outside of himself, like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. For Spencer, it was a day marked not just by loss, but by regret. He couldn't protect his nephews from the system that had failed his sister, and as the coffin disappeared into the abbey, he knew nothing would ever undo the pain of what those boys had been forced to endure. Spencer's explosive eulogy. Inside Westminster Abbey, the world waited to hear what Diana's younger brother would say. Charles Spencer walked to the podium with the weight of millions on his shoulders, his face pale but resolute. No one knew exactly what his speech would contain. Some expected polite words of remembrance, a reflection on Diana's charity work, or a simple farewell. Instead, Spencer delivered something that shook the Abbey to its core. He spoke not only of his sister, but for her. He described Diana as the most hunted person of the modern age, a woman crushed under the relentless pressure of media intrusion and abandoned by those who should have protected her. His words carried anger as much as sorrow. Unlike the careful tones of royal speeches, Spencer's voice was sharp, direct, and unflinching. He didn't soften the truth. He laid it bare for the world to hear. When he turned his attention to William and Harry, the silence grew even heavier. He promised that Diana's blood family, not the Windsors, would guide and protect the boys, ensuring they were not consumed by the same forces that had destroyed their mother. It was a vow spoken in defiance of the monarchy itself, a declaration that Diana's sons would not belong entirely to the institution that had failed her. In that moment, Spencer wasn't just giving a eulogy. He was drawing a line in the sand. The reaction was unlike anything seen at a royal funeral. At first, there was stunned silence, and then, unexpectedly, applause. Dignitaries, celebrities, and everyday mourners sitting inside Westminster Abbey clapped, breaking centuries of tradition. The Queen and senior royals sat motionless, their faces tight with disapproval, but the people had heard exactly what they needed. For them, Spencer had said what no royal dared to admit, that Diana had been wronged, that she had suffered, and that her death was not just tragedy, but injustice. Spencer's speech sent ripples far beyond the Abbey walls. Outside, the streets of London erupted with cheers and tears as word of his words spread. It was as if he had spoken directly to the anger and heartbreak of millions. To this day, his eulogy is remembered not only as one of the most powerful ever given at a funeral, but also as a rare moment when truth pierced through the formality of monarchy. The final letter. Months before the crash in Paris, Diana sat down and wrote something that still sends shivers down the spine of anyone who reads it. It wasn't a press statement. It wasn't a diary entry. It was a personal letter, one of the last she would ever write, and it carried words that felt like a prophecy. In it, Diana confessed she feared her life would be cut short in a staged car accident. She wrote that someone was planning an accident in my car, brake failure, and serious head injury, and that this was no paranoid thought, but a genuine fear she carried every day. For her brother Charles Spencer, discovering this letter was like being handed a key to a dark truth the world never wanted to face. Diana had always been open about feeling unsafe, especially after her divorce from Prince Charles. She told friends she believed there were forces working against her, that her growing popularity and independence had made her a problem for the establishment. For years, people dismissed these claims as dramatics, or the worries of a woman under constant stress. But when her death unfolded exactly the way she had described, those words could no longer be brushed aside. They became haunting evidence that Diana might have known what was coming. Spencer has broken his silence about this letter more than once, but each time it carries the same weight. He doesn't present it as speculation. He presents it as fact. For him, this letter isn't just a piece of paper. It is proof that Diana felt hunted, cornered, and vulnerable in the final months of her life. And when he speaks of it, his voice is filled with the pain of someone who knows his sister's greatest fear came true. When the letter became public years later, it set off a storm of conspiracy theories. How could she have written something so specific? Why hadn't the warnings been taken seriously? Questions spread like wildfire, and for many, the official explanation of a tragic accident never felt satisfying again. Spencer himself has said the words still haunt him, that every time he thinks of Diana's final days, he remembers how clearly she tried to warn those around her. To this day, the letter stands as one of the most chilling artifacts connected to Diana's death. It isn't just her handwriting on the page, it's her voice, her fear, her truth. And while some may dismiss it, for millions it is impossible to ignore. If Diana predicted her own end, was it really fate that took her life in Paris? Or was it something far darker? That question has lingered for decades, and every time Spencer speaks about the letter, the world is reminded that Diana's story may not be as simple as the history books claim. The cover-up allegations. From the very moment Diana's death was announced, something about the official story didn't sit right with millions of people. The world was told it was a tragic accident. Her driver had been speeding, trying to escape the paparazzi, and he lost control in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. But the more people looked at the details, the harder it became to accept. Why did it take so long for Diana to reach the hospital when Paris is full of medical centers just minutes away? Why were the paparazzi snapping photos instead of helping her as she lay dying in the wreckage? And why did her fears, written in that chilling letter months earlier, line up so precisely with the way she lost her life? Charles Spencer has never called her death an accident in simple terms. For him, there were too many unanswered questions, too many shadows lurking in the background. He knew his sister well. He knew she was often anxious, but rarely irrational. If Diana felt her life was under threat, he believed her. And when her death happened, in almost the exact way she had predicted, suspicion was no longer something whispered. It became a roar. The investigations that followed only deepened the sense of doubt. French officials declared the driver was drunk, and that was that. But others pointed to strange details: missing CCTV footage from the tunnel, inconsistencies in the accounts of witnesses, and the bizarre behavior of those who should have protected her. Even years later, the inquest in Britain left the haunting conclusion that Diana was unlawfully killed, though no one was held responsible. To the public, it felt like truth was always just out of reach, buried beneath layers of secrecy. For Spencer, this wasn't just about a crash. It was about the way his sister had been treated for years. Hounded by the press, ignored by the palace, and left without the protection she deserved. He saw her death not as a sudden tragedy, but as the final chapter in a long story of neglect. And when he speaks about it, the anger in his voice makes it clear. Diana didn't just die in Paris. She was failed by the very people who should have kept her safe. The idea of a cover-up has never gone away. Every anniversary of her death brings new theories, new documentaries, new questions that refuse to fade. Some believe powerful forces wanted her silenced, that her growing independence was too dangerous for the monarchy. Others see the hand of the press, chasing her until there was nowhere left to run. Whatever the truth may be, the letter Diana left behind makes it impossible to dismiss her death as simple misfortune. It feels too precise, too cruel, too much like destiny written in her own hand. The royal family's cold silence. While the world was drowning in grief, the palace seemed frozen in time. From the moment Diana's death was confirmed, thousands of mourners rushed to Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace, laying flowers, cards, and candles until the pavements were buried beneath waves of color. Strangers hugged each other in the streets, grown men wept openly, and children clutched photographs of the princess who had touched their lives. Yet from the royal family, there was nothing. No statement, no flag lowered to half-mast, no sign that they were mourning with the people. For days, their silence grew louder. At Balmoral, where William and Harry had been staying with their father, Prince Charles, the mood was eerily still. Behind closed doors, the boys were told their mother was gone, but there was little comfort, no open tears, no words of solace beyond the formal. Harry, only 12, would later reveal that he kept asking the same question over and over. Is she really gone? That hollow quiet inside Balmoral stood in stark contrast to the raw emotion pouring from the streets of London. The public's patience snapped quickly. Newspapers that had once been deferential to the monarchy now screamed headlines of betrayal. Where is our queen? And your people are mourning. Show us you care. For the first time in living memory, the monarchy looked out of touch with its own nation. The people's princess had died, and the people themselves felt abandoned by the very institution that should have shared their sorrow. Charles Spencer felt the same anger. He had watched his sister suffer in silence for years, only to see her abandoned again in death. He believed Diana had been pushed aside by the palace, treated as an outsider even after her divorce, and her funeral arrangements proved it once more. The decision to make William and Harry walk behind their mother's coffin, despite his protests, was to him the final act of cruelty. He would never forgive it. It wasn't until September 5th, 5 days after Diana's death, that Queen Elizabeth finally addressed the nation. Sitting before the cameras, she spoke of Diana as an exceptional and gifted human being, praising her devotion to William and Harry. For some, the words were moving, but for many, it was too little, too late. The silence of those first 5 days had left a scar that no speech could erase. Spencer's lifelong fight. Charles Spencer never allowed Diana's story to fade into the polished version the palace wanted the world to accept. From the moment of her death, he became one of the few voices willing to challenge the institution head-on, speaking out about how his sister had been treated. To him, Diana had been more than a princess. She was a young woman thrust into a world of rigid rules, forced smiles, and constant surveillance. And even when she needed protection the most, she was left exposed. In interviews over the years, Spencer spoke about the many times Diana had turned to him in distress. She called him late at night, her voice trembling, telling him how lonely she felt and how trapped she was inside the system. He described her as the most hunted woman of the modern age, and he made it clear that her suffering wasn't just caused by the paparazzi, but by the royal family's indifference. For Spencer, the monarchy had used Diana when it suited them, and cast her aside when it didn't. That belief burned even brighter after her death. Spencer often pointed out that she had no proper security the night she died, even though she was the mother of the future king. To him, this wasn't negligence, it was a failure of duty. He argued that the palace knew how much danger Diana was in. They knew she was followed constantly, hounded to the point of exhaustion. And yet, they offered no protection. The result was inevitable. She had been left vulnerable, and her fears in that final letter proved she knew it too. His anger reached its most powerful moment during his eulogy, when he promised Diana's blood family would protect William and Harry. But in the years that followed, he admitted that promise had been impossible to keep. The boys were already bound tightly to the royal system, shaped and controlled by an institution he could not penetrate. It was a regret that weighed heavily on him, knowing he couldn't shield them from the very forces that had crushed their mother. For Diana's sons, the trauma of 1997 never really ended. That walk behind their mother's coffin, the silence at Balmoral, and the years of whispers about her death left scars that shaped the men they became. William carried his grief inward, channeling it into duty, a steady hand determined to preserve the crown. Harry, on the other hand, carried his grief like a wound that never fully healed, one that later burst open when he spoke about his struggles with the institution that had once silenced his mother. Charles Spencer always knew the boys had been forced into a role no child should bear. He tried to shield them, tried to be the voice their mother would have wanted, but the monarchy was stronger than his promises. As the years passed, he watched William and Harry grow into their roles, knowing that the very system Diana feared was shaping them every single day. His regret over not being able to protect them the way he vowed during his eulogy never left him. Even decades later, when William and Harry speak about their mother, the shadow of that August night in Paris hangs heavy. The conspiracy theories, the unanswered questions, the final letter, all of it lingers like an unfinished story. For Diana's sons, moving forward has never meant leaving the past behind. And for Charles Spencer, speaking out has always meant making sure the world never forgets the price they all paid. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.